Thanks for joining us. You've tuned into Arirang's Within the Frame. I'm Handan in Seoul. 677.4 trillion won, or roughly $506 billion US. That's the size of next year's budget proposed by the government, while keeping the budget increase within the 3% range for the second straight year. To ensure the country's fiscal health, the government prioritized people's livelihoods, expanding the budget for the health, welfare, and labor sectors. It also restored support for R&D to help local companies secure a competitive edge on the global stage. Meanwhile, President Yoon Suk-yeol has outlined national pension reform plans with the aim of establishing a sustainable funding mechanism and promoting intergenerational fairness. 2025 budget and pension reform. That's the topic of our discussion today. And for some expert insights, we have Professor Kim Se-wan at Ewha Women's University joining us via Skype. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me today.
We're also delighted to have with us tonight Professor Song Soo-young at Chungang University. It's been a while since we last spoke. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, good evening to you, and thank you for inviting me.
All right, Professor Kim, let's kick things off with you. So the government has proposed a budget of 677.4 trillion won, adhering to tight fiscal discipline for the second straight year. It's up just 3.2% from this year. How do you see this?
First of all, it should be pointed out that next year's budget has been constructed with an austerity stance. The Ministry of Economy and Finance says that total government expenditure plan of 677.4 trillion won for 2025 will be submitted to National Assembly. The government expenditure for next year represents an increase of 3.2% compared to this year's budget. Unlike President Moon's administration, which increased the government budget by 8.6% on average from 2017 to 2022, President Yoon's administration emphasizes fiscal soundness and government budget growth rate reduced to 5.1% last year and 2.8% this year at the lowest rate. One of the key features of next year's budget proposal is minimizing the discretionary spending, excluding mandatory expenditures such as basic pension, child allowances, and civil servant salaries. Particularly the budget for SOC, or social overhead capital, a representative discretionary spending category, has been set at 25.5 trillion won, a 3.6% reduction compared to previous year. This marks the second consecutive year of budget cuts in SOC sector.
And we'll discuss more about minimizing the growth rate of discretionary spending as we move on. But before that, Professor Song, actually that is our very next question. So the government minimized the growth rate of discretionary spending, excluding mandatory expenditures, as Professor Kim just pointed out, such as basic pensions, child allowances, and civil servant salaries. The social overhead capital was cut by 3.6%. What's your take on the government's budgetary approach?
Yeah, I think the budget for the vulnerables and economic vitality and also structural improvements for the economy, I agree with that objects and the pillars, but what is very unique and distinctive was building a safe society and strengthening global leadership in diplomacy. Clearly, this is related with the issue of the APEC, which will be held in Gyeongju in the next year. So I think the budget plays a very big role in these some diplomacy leadership is important for the next year's budget. And also what I'm most concerned is in order to maintain the 3% rule of fiscal rule, to keep the fiscal rule within the, to maintain the deficit within the 3%, Then the government decided to cut the social overhead capital, as Professor Kim already mentioned, but that part is particularly focused on the maintenance cost. So this implies that in the next year, if the necessary steps to maintain and to improve the quality of the infrastructure that is going to be deteriorated clearly. So what I'm concerned is that might cause some kind of a disaster in the infrastructure. So that is my primary concern. So I would rather suggest the government to make adjustment. Even they could have established a supplementary budget is possible. So they don't have to worry about the fiscal deficit, and they should not stick to the fiscal rule to keep the budget deficit within 3%.
So I think you voiced quite a strong opposition to the government's budget plan. So you're saying that it should further expand the budget. It shouldn't be overly concerned about sticking to the 3% rule. And it should expand and spend much on critical domains such as social infrastructure. Now, Professor Kim, tightening the belt is essential for maintaining Korea's fiscal health, given the record level of national debt and tax deficits, although Professor Song has a somewhat different idea. But some are also concerned that this approach could negatively impact efforts to boost domestic spending. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you. It is understandable that Korean government budget for next year is designed under austerity stance because government's debt has been quickly increasing over COVID pandemic from 2020 up to over 50% of the GDP. But in this year, one of the major reasons that Korean economy is not recovering fast is a weakening domestic expenditures from households and private corporations. Last month, both the government and KDI, which is government think tank, pointed out that weak domestic expenditure is mostly due to higher interest rate. It means that Korean government's policy direction in stimulating domestic expenditure is on lowering domestic interest rate by Bank of Korea while restricting government's expenditure to restore fiscal health. This is the reason why presidential office was unhappy with Bank of Korea's base interest rate freeze 2 weeks ago.
So you're saying what's more important than the budgetary fiscal policy is lowering the interest rates to boost domestic spending. And in a related question, Professor Kim, the combined government and household debt surpassed 3,000 trillion won. That's around $2.2 trillion for the first time at the end of the second quarter. Could this also hamper efforts to boost domestic spending?
Of course, along with continuing higher interest rate, increasing household debt limit further increase of domestic expenditure. As you pointed out, in the second quarter of this year, household debt surged to a record high of about 1,900 trillion won, increasing by about 14 trillion won in the second quarter alone. This sharp increase in household debt is attributed to the increase in housing transactions, which has led to corresponding increase in related loans like mortgage loans. In fact, as of the end of June, household loans, excluding sales credit, grew by 13.9 trillion won compared to the end of the previous quarter. Notably, mortgage loans within household credit saw a significant increase of 16 trillion Korean won. The steep rise in both national and household debt, coupled with prolonged high interest rate, is tightening government and private sector spending. Due to the growing debt burdens, there are concerns that government's total expenditure and interest rate cuts are becoming more constrained. That reduces the flexibility of fiscal and monetary policies in the middle of increasing domestic and international uncertainties.
And before we move on to our next question, just as a side note for our viewers, some are already voicing strong opposition, saying that the next year's budget is insufficient in boosting Korea's sluggish domestic spending. And in response, the government stressed the importance of private sector-led economy rather than relying on a fiscal-driven what it called artificial stimulus. So we'll see how things pan out from here. And Professor Song, the managed fiscal deficit, which reflects the state of the nation's finances, is projected to reach 78 trillion won, or roughly $58 billion. And you've briefly touched upon this, but the government aims to keep the deficit within 3% of GDP in line with fiscal rules until 2028. Could you help us understand what does the 3% target signify and how feasible is it in your view?
Okay, let me tell you first about the managed fiscal balance is the fiscal deficit when you exclude the Social Security revenue. And the consolidated fiscal balance is the total revenue out of the total expenditure. Still, this current government has some deficit is prevalent, but managed fiscal balance when the social security revenue is that, even though it is not a tax revenue, but it works similar to the role. So currently, still there's some positive revenue is included. Then the fiscal balance looks a little bit improved one, but manage the fiscal balance, those should be removed, and then that is the true face of the deficit. But as you mentioned, the 3%, when the government sticks to the 3% rule and this kind of fiscal rule, that could have a really damage on some recovery of the economy, and it could hamper the consumption increase, which is essential for the economy to recover. Currently, Korean economy has shown relatively very good in export. Net export is very nice because of the good performance of the semiconductor and car sales in the U.S. and some Western world. But that does not help much about the domestic economy and the domestic consumption at all. Therefore, I'd like to urge the government should pay attention and take care of domestic economy rather than multinational enterprise performance, which put a cosmetic on the face of the ill patient. So I believe that the government is required to take care of domestic ill patients who have suffered so much from the sputtering economy right now.
And on top of those factors, Korea is also expected to see a tax revenue deficit of nearly 20 trillion won next year. So it looks like it'll be quite challenging to keep the deficit within the target goal of 3% of GDP. And staying with you, Professor Song, moving on to President Yoon's pension reform plan. One key principle of the reform is to differentiate contribution rates for young and old generations. Now, this is aimed at easing the burden on younger people as they have to contribute for a longer period of time and receive payments at a much later date. What's your take on this?
Actually, I have seen the news about the pension reform, which was suggested by the President Yoon recently. So there is a clear message about the direction of the pension reform is one is that some tiered contribution rate should be adjusted along with the age. And the next one is the automatic stabilizer of the pension. Both have some problems. Of course, there could be some benefit, but that is already advertised and so much and praised so much by the government. So I would like to point out the potential serious damages or the problems in this pension reform. First one is the age difference, particularly, for example, the old generation who are supposed to pay higher in contribution, that could provide the incentive for the old generation to retire earlier before this pension reform is implemented. So that caused a serious fiscal deficit burden for the government, unnecessary burden. And another one is, for example, if the 50-year-old is a boundary to determine the level of contribution rate, which will be revised up from the 9% to 13% or 14%, then the problem is 50 years and 1 day old, and 49 years old, and 364 days old. Those two similar aged persons could face quite different contribution rate. So that could cause a really problem. And another one is particularly the pension from automatic stabilizer. This is a stabilizer only for the pension fund itself. So per se, it should be work against the fiscal policy to stimulate the economy when the economy is particularly in recess or in the consumption or some growth rate of the economy is very low. Then the government should provoke the economy to recover and increase the consumption. But however, the automatic stabilizer works against because it takes more money to stabilize the pension fund level, then they takes more contribution out of the people's pocket, which means disposable income for the people will be reduced when the economy is in bad situation. This is exactly against government role with the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. So this is a potential danger and the serious problem and the weaknesses of the automatic stabilizer pension fund. So this should be discarded. I really suggest that this automatic stabilizer program should be discarded and should not be effective for the pension fund reform.
Again, quite a strong opposition to the government's reform plan. You've pointed out various factors that points to the fact that there are so much more complexities for a proper reform than just differentiating the contribution rates between generations, and also it takes a lot more than just an automatic stabilization mechanism. But going back to the details President Yoon outlined, Professor Kim, he didn't set the exact contribution rates for each generation. Now, given that the contribution rate in the current pension scheme is universally set at 9% of all wage earners and business owners' income here in Korea, how much of an increase do you project for the young and the old generation?
Actually, revising national pension contribution rate is a key issue and at the same time very sensitive issue in pension reform. It looks that government's plan is to adjust the speed of increasing the current contribution rate from 9% to 13% based on age groups. As of now, the most likely option is to gradually raise the rate for people in their 20s over 20 years. And for those in their 30s, over 10 years. This generation-based differentiated adjustment system involves rapidly increasing the contribution rate for those in their 40s and 50s who are closer to receiving their pensions, while slowing down the rate of increase for those in their 20s and 30s. It means that there could be intergenerational conflicts on the burden of raising contribution rates if we don't reach a social consensus. So under these circumstances, the government's role and Congress' role is very important to harmonize different voices on the issue of raising contribution rate.
Now, before we wrap up, Professor Song, you've mentioned that differentiating contribution rates for young and old generations will have certain side effects, and the automatic stabilization mechanism would not be that effective. Then what alternatives do we have to reform the national pension system?
Yeah, the sudden increase of the contribution rate clearly has an adverse effect. Rather, I would like to defer the entitlement age to be eligible for the pension recipient. So which means currently 63 years old is the age who become eligible for the pension reception. So pension payment, then it could be increased gradually to 65 years old. I think that would be the appropriate way to avoid some resistance and some adverse incentive for the for the older generations to retire early. So that is one way to do that. And then current pension reform, the government plan has postulated some income replacement rate as 40%, which is very low. So that should be increased to 44%, which was conceded by the opposition party from the 45%. But ultimately, eventually, we don't have to need to stick to some robustness of the pension fund itself. When we maintain a certain level of pension fund forever, it means those monies cannot be used for the welfare improvement for the people at all, because they have to maintain that level always. So eventually, I would like the government and the people should admit that the tax should be the source to guarantee the pension payment for the older generations for the retirement age.
All right, and we'll conclude our discussions there. Thank you, as always, Professor Song, for your analysis.
Thank you.
And thank you as well, Professor Kim, for your perspectives.
Thank you very much.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.